They called her a thief in front of everyone. Aslan stood in the aisle of the department store, her hands trembling as two uniformed officers blocked her path. Her daughter's birthday dress still hung over her arm, the soft lavender fabric now crumpled and stained with the panic in her fingertips. People were watching, whispering, some snickering. The store manager, a short man with nervous eyes, had kept repeating the word, "Ma'am," in a voice that didn't sound like it meant respect. One of the officers asked her to step aside. She did, not because she agreed, not because she was guilty, but because the moment she saw their hands hovering near their belts, she remembered what fear felt like in her throat. It wasn't the first time someone had decided she didn't belong. Oh, that her skin meant suspicion, that her silence meant confession. "Ma'am, we've been notified that you were attempting to leave without paying." The words kept echoing in her mind. Even as she tried to explain, the receipt was in her phone. She had scanned it. Her bank had been charged. They didn't want to hear about apps or glitches. They wanted her quiet. Hands behind her back. The cold metal bit into her wrists like betrayal. She didn't cry, not then, not when they walked her past rows of shoppers, not when a little boy asked his mother if bad people looked like that. She didn't even cry when they closed the cruiser door behind her, and she watched the store shrink into the distance. She cried later in the holding cell. Alone, not for the handcuffs, not for the humiliation, but for her daughter. It was Zuri's birthday, her 7th. And Aslan had promised this year would be different. Better. She'd taken extra shifts at the clinic, stayed up, folding linens long after the other nurses went home, saved every spare dollar just to give Zuri the dress she wanted. It's the one with the butterfly sleeves and the glittering sash. Now she was here, behind steel bars, wearing shame like a second skin. It wasn't the first time the world tried to erase her, but this time they did it with flashing lights and false accusations, and she knew deep down that this wasn't just a mistake. This was a setup, because she'd seen the clerk's eyes when she walked in. He hadn't even tried to hide it. The way he followed her, the way he nudged the manager when she reached for her wallet. She was guilty the moment she walked through those doors, guilty of existing in a world that still measured truth by color, and now she had to figure out how to get out before the system swallowed her whole. The days after her arrest moved like shadows, long, heavy, and silent. Aslan was released the next morning with no apology, no explanation. Just a yellow slip in her hand with the court date and a cold warning about returning to the store. She walked home. Her phone had died in the station. Her charger was in her purse, which they hadn't returned. Zuri had spent the night with their downstairs neighbor, an older woman named Miss Clara, who used to watch Zuri when Aslan pulled doubles. She didn't ask too many questions, and Aslan didn't offer answers. Zuri ran into her arms when she opened the door. Her soft curls smelled like coconut oil and sleep, and Aslan held her for a long time. Her little girl didn't ask about the party. She didn't mention the cake that never came or the dress that never made it home. She just whispered, "I missed you, Mama," and somehow that made everything worse. That afternoon, Aslan sat at the edge of her unmade bed and stared at the cracked phone screen. The case report was already online. Aslan Monroe suspected retail theft. No conviction, just suspicion. But in her world, suspicion was enough to destroy everything she'd built. By Monday, she was called into the clinic supervisor's office. "We have to place you on administrative leave pending investigation," her boss said, not meeting her eyes. "You understand how it looks, right?" She nodded, because she did understand. It didn't matter that she had never missed a shift, never taken a single day of sick leave, never spoken back. One allegation, one mugshot online, and she was poisoned. The locker where she kept her lunch and Zuri's drawings was already emptied as she left through the back door. She passed Martha from reception, who quickly turned away and began pretending to sort papers. She passed Janice from the ER, who used to share stories about her grandkids. Janice just pursed her lips like she'd bitten something sour and hurried past without a word. She had become invisible, worse, untouchable. Rent was due in 2 weeks. Utilities in 3. Zuri's school fees were already late. She tried calling the store. Spoke calmly. Asked for a copy of the surveillance tape, which she had every right to request. The manager said it was under legal review. His voice, too soft and too smooth, felt rehearsed. She called legal aid. They were overbooked, underfunded. Someone could see her in 4 weeks. She applied for temporary benefits. Her application was flagged because of the arrest, one by one. Now the lifeline snapped. Even Miss Clara, who had always been kind, began keeping her distance. Not out of cruelty, Aislinn thought, but out of fear. People like Miss Clara had lived too many decades with too many hard lessons. Survival meant silence, but silence was suffocating her. Each night Aislinn waited until Zuri had gone to sleep too. Cry. She'd curl into the far side of the bed, biting her lip to keep from sobbing too loud. The weight of it all pressed down on her chest like a stone, not just the arrest, but the humiliation, the rejection, the slow erosion of who she was. Still she didn't break. Not completely, because one morning something shifted. Zuri came into the kitchen holding a hand-drawn picture. It was a clumsy sketch in colored pencil, a woman in a long cape standing tall while police officers bowed their heads. In crayon, Zuri had written, "My mommy is a hero." Aislinn couldn't breathe for a moment. Zuri didn't know everything. Somehow she knew. She taped the drawing to the refrigerator. It fluttered every time she opened the door, a fragile reminder that even in the dark someone still saw the light in her. And then a stranger knocked on her door. It was early evening. Aislinn opened it cautiously, prepared for another notice, another question, another insult in professional clothing. But it was a man, young, maybe late 20s. He wore a brown hoodie and scuffed sneakers, and introduced himself as Damon. A new tenant in the building. He didn't ask about the arrest. He just said he'd heard Zuri liked books and that he had a few his younger cousin had outgrown. She almost said no, but something in his eyes didn't flinch when he looked at her, so she nodded, and he smiled, not wide, not eager, just real. The next day, a small stack of gently used children's books sat outside her door. No note, no fuss. Just quiet kindness. It didn't solve anything, but it softened something inside her that had been hard for too long. And in the quiet moments that followed, when she held Zuri close, when she watched the refrigerator drawing sway, when she turned the pages of those secondhand books, Aislinn began to remember the strength she had spent years hiding, because before she was accused, before she was erased, she had been something more, something powerful, something hidden, and if the world had forgotten, maybe it was time she reminded them. Aislinn hadn't touched her old laptop in months. Under folded towels and a box of Zuri's baby clothes she could never bring herself to give away. The screen had a faint crack in the corner. The battery barely held a charge, but when she pressed the power button and the machine sputtered to life, she felt a flicker of something she hadn't felt in weeks. Controlled. There was nothing dramatic about that morning. Zuri had gone to school humming, wearing the lavender scarf Aislinn had sewn from a dollar store remnant. The refrigerator hummed quietly. The apartment was still too cold. But Aislinn sat at the edge of the sofa, the laptop balanced on her knees, and stared at a blank document for almost an hour before she typed a single word. Resume. She hadn't needed one in years. The clinic job had come through a friend of a friend. It was supposed to be temporary, but then Zuri came and plans changed. There hadn't been time to revisit the woman she used to be. The woman before the stethoscope and patient charts. Woman trained to read people in a glance. To vanish in plain sight. To dismantle a threat with a flick of her wrist. That woman had been sleeping, but now she stirred. It started small. She updated her information on a secure federal database she hadn't accessed in a decade. The interface had changed, the passwords reset. When she finally got through, her profile blinked back at her agent A. Monroe. Inactive but not forgotten, the field had been her life before Zuri. 12 years of embedded operations, international surveillance, soft cover assignments, never the glamorous kind. No tuxedos, no fast cars. Just long days, deeper shadows, and the knowledge that the smallest detail could unravel everything. She hadn't left because she wanted to. She left because she had no choice. When she got pregnant, her handler gave her 2 options: disappear and give the baby up, or walk away and never come back. She chose Zuri, and for a long time, she believed she'd made peace with that decision. But now, staring at her record. She saw the woman she used to be, the one who didn't flinch at confrontation, who didn't crumble under injustice. That woman wasn't dead. Oh, she was bruised, tired, forgotten, but she was still hers, still watching. That afternoon, no subject, no sender, just a single line. You were never alone. It could have been spam. It could have been anything. But Aislinn knew better. Someone still had eyes on her. Not in a threatening way, in a way that made her remember the feeling of having a team, of knowing someone had your back even when you didn't ask. She didn't reply, didn't need to. The message wasn't for discussion. It was a reminder that night she dreamt of Budapest. It had been a silent mission. Long before Zuri, she'd spent 6 days embedded as a language tutor in a diplomat's home. She wore a different accent, a different name, slept lightly. Listened more. On the 5th night, she intercepted a conversation that saved 3 lives and ended one. She'd always remembered the boy, just 17, smuggling documents in his belt buckle. He had looked so scared, and afterward, she'd sat alone in a cold hotel room, cleaning blood from her hands, wondering if the job would ever feel less heavy. It never did, but she carried it, and now she had to carry something heavier, the burden of being disbelieved, of being dehumanized in her own country. She started writing letters, not to anyone in particular, just thoughts, fragments of herself. She wrote about Zuri's laugh, about the nurse who used to compliment her braids, but hadn't spoken since the arrest. She didn't know why she wrote. Maybe to find clarity. Maybe to stop feeling like she was disappearing one day. She wrote a letter she never intended to send. To the officer who cuffed me, she began. She didn't blame him, not entirely. She blamed the assumptions that guided his hands, the system, that taught him who to trust and who to fear. Yes. The way he looked at her, not like a woman or a mother, but like a file to process. She ended the letter with a line she didn't expect. You don't know me, but you will. The next morning she found a note under her door, folded, unsigned. You're stronger than they know. It wasn't Damon's handwriting. It wasn't Miss Clara's either. But it didn't matter. Someone saw her. The spark was small, but it was there. She applied for a remote research role through a private security contractor. The job required clearance she still technically held. Though the sound of laughter in the kitchen had become Aislinn's favorite part of the day, Dari's giggles echoed off the cracked tile as she tried to frost cupcakes with far too much icing. The light from the window hit her cheekbones, and for a second Aislinn forgot everything else, the fear, the arrest, the ache behind her smile. In that moment, all she saw was her daughter alive, joyful, untouched. Aislinn had begun to breathe. Again, she wore lipstick for the first time in months. Her contract work was steady. Though the courtroom date loomed ahead like a wall she wasn't ready to climb, there was structure now, a rhythm. Hope didn't feel like a lie anymore. It felt like maybe, just maybe she might be okay then. Came the envelope, thick, heavy, dropped through the mail slot with a thud that startled her. She opened it with fingers she didn't realize were trembling. The prosecution had filed for an early motion to present expanded evidence. Body cam footage from another arrest that had nothing to do with her case. The language was careful, almost sanitized, but she could read between every line. They were painting her as a repeat offender. They were calling her dangerous. There were whispers of a pattern of behavior, even though the only pattern was the color of her skin and the poverty of her zip code. Her hands went cold. The laptop she'd worked so hard to open each day now felt like an anchor dragging her under. She stared at the words until they blurred. They weren't just trying to convict her. They were trying to erase her. She met with her court-appointed attorney the next morning. He was late, young, overworked. He shuffled papers without looking at her, mumbled something about procedural hurdles in a tough climate right now. When she asked if he believed her, he didn't answer. That's when it hit her. She was alone, not just in court, in everything. They didn't see her, not as a mother, not as a woman who had once risked her life to keep others safe, not as someone who had buried friends in unnamed graves for a government that would never admit her name in public. She walked home in silence, the city suddenly louder than usual. The traffic felt aggressive, the crosswalks too fast. Aislinn nodded automatically, her mouth saying yes while her chest caved. And quietly, After Zuri went to bed, Aislinn sat on the kitchen floor and sobbed until her ribs ached. It wasn't just the case, it was the exhaustion, the shame of having to prove your worth every time someone looked at you. The weight of knowing one misstep could mean the difference between safety and a cage. She had fought wars in silence, and now, in her own country, she was losing a battle she didn't even start. Her phone buzzed. A text. From a restricted number. It read, "Don't show up to court without protection. No name. No context. Just a warning. The world didn't make sense anymore." She dug through an old box that night, pulled out a dusty folder. Inside was a laminated card, an outdated CIA field ID. She held it in her hand, not for validation, but as proof that she had existed, that she had mattered. The truth couldn't protect her. The next day she was pulled over on her way to pick up groceries. No explanation. Officer said the taillight was out. It wasn't he asked her to step out of the vehicle. She complied. She didn't argue. She didn't cry. She just stood there, heart steady, pulse calm, until she noticed his hand resting on his weapon. That's when her knees buckled. Not from fear of dying, from the helplessness of surviving. He let her go with a warning. But the message was clear. They were watching. The message hadn't been a warning. It had been a promise. The system wasn't just broken. It was rigged. The courtroom was weeks away, but they were already bleeding her out. Small cuts. Quiet humiliation. Paper wounds that would never make headlines. She thought of disappearing again. It would be easy. She still knew the roots. Still had friends in shadows. Zuri would be safer in another life, in another name. Maybe one where her mother wasn't called a criminal, but then she looked at her daughter asleep on the couch, clutching a library book, like it was gold, and she knew she couldn't run. Not again, not this time. But that didn't mean she had a plan. She baked cupcakes, she answered emails. She filed reports no one would ever read. And every night, she cried in the shower with the water running loud enough to mask her sobs. Aislinn began waking up before her alarm, not out of discipline, but because her mind no longer allowed rest. The courtroom date was etched into her calendar in bold red, but it may as well have been carved into her bones. Time moved both too fast and not at all. Every sunrise felt like a countdown. She still made breakfast for Zuri, still braided her hair, still made her lunches with handwritten notes folded carefully into sandwich bags. Those small acts felt sacred now, like they were holding the universe together, thread by fraying thread. One morning, while dropping Zuri off at school, a woman in a blue coat tapped her shoulder gently. She introduced herself as Zuri's art teacher. Her voice was quiet, almost hesitant. She just wanted to thank Aislinn for the cupcakes last week, she said, and then added that Zuri often stayed behind after class to help clean up, always with a smile. Always polite. Aislinn thanked her, blinking against the sudden sting behind her eyes. That small kindness cracked something open later that day. While walking past the community center, Aislinn stopped in. She hadn't meant to, but something about the open door and the soft music spilling out pulled her in. Inside, kids were painting, messy hands, bright colors. After so honest it shook the dust off her lungs. She stood there for a long moment before someone noticed. An older man, tall and thin, with silver stubble on his chin, waved her over, said they could use another set of eyes. So she stayed. Only for an hour, then she came back the next day. Then again, no one asked who she was or what she'd done. They just let her help. She passed out snacks, cleaned brushes, refilled water cups. She listened to stories about monsters and dreams, and broken crayons. And for the first time in months, she laughed, not politely, not cautiously, but freely. Each child felt like a thread stitching her soul back together. One afternoon, while reorganizing the supply shelf, she overheard a teenage boy trying to explain to a younger girl that her brother wasn't bad, just misunderstood. The words struck her like lightning. Misunderstood. That was the word no one had used for her. No judge, no cop, no neighbor. It made her chest tighten, but it also gave her clarity. She wasn't powerless. She was just unheard, and she still had a voice. That night, she sat down with a notebook. Pages yellowed from time and untouched memories. She began to write. Not for court, not for defense, but for herself. For Zuri. For the version of her who had once believed the truth always won. She wrote about the day she was recruited, now the mission. That broke her. The child soldier she couldn't save. She wrote about the fear that never left. The nights she'd wake up thinking she was still being followed. The guilt of being alive when so many were not. It wasn't just therapy. It was resurrection. And slowly, the words became a weapon. Not the kind that bruises skin, but the kind that awakens. In the following days, she began preparing for court differently. Not just with her attorney, but with her own documents, character references, training certificates, and most importantly, her truth written in her voice, not the government's. She contacted an old friend from the agency, not someone in power, just someone who still believed in decency. She didn't ask for favors, just context. Couldn't say much, but he did confirm what she feared. Someone high up wanted her silenced, and not because she was guilty, but because she was inconvenient the next morning. She walked into the community center with a printed copy of her story and handed it to the director. Told him to do with it what he wished. Maybe it could be used to teach the older teens about resilience. He read it silently, then hugged her. No one had hugged her like that in years. That night she sat with Ziri in bed and asked if she ever felt scared about what people were saying. Ziri looked up and shook her head. She said, "No, because I know my mom's not who they think she is. I know who you are." And Aislin's heart, battered, bruised, but still beating, swelled. In the final days before the court date, Aislinn no longer walked with her head down. She still feared the outcome, but she didn't fear herself anymore. She had stopped apologizing for being complex, for being wounded, yes, for surviving things people couldn't imagine. She wasn't angry anymore. She was awake, and that was more dangerous than anything else. The courtroom was colder than she remembered. Not just the air conditioning, but the air itself. Like the room was waiting to see if she'd break again. The polished floor reflected too much light, the ceiling too high. Everything designed to shrink the person standing alone before the judge. Aislinn adjusted the simple blazer she had borrowed from the community center's director. It didn't fit perfectly, but she wore it like armor. She clutched her file with both hands, fingertips going white. Her attorney gave her a small nod but said nothing. They both knew this day wasn't about evidence. It was about perception. Aislinn had been misjudged from the beginning. When her name was called, she stood slowly. The ones that had labeled her, doubted her, whispered about her. Even now, the murmur in the gallery stung like salt. The prosecutor spoke first, calm, controlled, reiterated the charges, suggested a pattern. A woman who had worked in dangerous environments and maybe brought those dangers back with her. He referenced an anonymous tip. He painted her as erratic, secretive, possibly unstable. Each word felt like a nail, not just in her coffin, in the version of herself she had worked so hard to rebuild. Then it was her turn. She stepped forward, the file trembling in her grip. She didn't look at the prosecutor or the judge. She looked at the court reporter, the security guard, the woman in the back row holding a baby. She looked at the people. Oh, the ones who might one day find themselves in her place, and then she began. She didn't defend herself the way they expected. She didn't list credentials or sight rank. Instead, she told the story of a woman who had served quietly, carrying the weight of missions no one would ever hear about. She spoke of the lives saved, mistakes made, the silence she had been trained to live in, and the cost of that silence. She told them how she came home from service, only to be treated like a threat. She didn't cry, but her voice cracked when she spoke of Zuri, how her daughter once asked if jail meant someone was bad, and how she had to explain that sometimes the system didn't care who was good, only who was easy to blame. She handed over her written statement, her service letters. The sealed document from the agency finally released through her friend's quiet persistence. It didn't list missions, but it acknowledged her service, her clearance, her integrity. The judge took his time. The room was silent, and then the prosecutor asked to cross-examine. He tried to shake her. Asked about inconsistencies, why she hadn't spoken up sooner, why her records were incomplete, why she disappeared for periods of time. She answered with calm clarity. She didn't flinch. She didn't apologize. She said, "I followed orders my whole life. And when the orders ended, I kept following silence. But I won't do that anymore." That was the moment the tide turned, not with thunder or applause, but with stillness. Even the prosecutor lowered his eyes. When the judge finally spoke, his words were measured. He acknowledged the pain she had endured, the dangerous assumption that a woman like her Black, quiet, guarded, must be hiding something criminal instead of something sacred. He dismissed the charges. He called the case a miscarriage of justice. But Aislinn didn't exhale until she left the building. Zuri was waiting outside, like a sign she made with markers. Said, "Welcome home, Mom." In crooked letters with hearts in the corners, Aislinn knelt and rapped, her arms around her. For the first time in what felt like forever, she let herself sob. Not from fear, not from pain, but from release. In the weeks that followed, the community center asked her to speak, not about being exonerated, but about resilience, about rebuilding identity, about finding purpose after silence. She didn't want fame or revenge. She just wanted others to know they weren't alone. Her story traveled quietly. A few local interviews, a podcast. Someone started calling her the quiet soldier. She didn't correct them. She found work consulting not with the government, but with nonprofits helping veterans reintegrate. She helped women coming out of incarceration rebuild their lives. She visited schools. They listened more than she spoke. And when she did speak, it was never to impress, only to connect. Zuri began telling her friends her mom was a superhero. Aislinn would smile, because in some ways, she finally believed that too. The scars didn't vanish, but they no longer defined her. She wasn't just a mother, or a veteran, or a wrongly accused woman. She was someone who had stood at the edge of ruin, walked back with grace. And as she watched Zuri ride her bike in the fading gold of a spring afternoon, she whispered softly to herself the words she once couldn't say aloud. "I survived, and I'm still standing. I'm still standing." The seasons passed more softly now. Long no longer measured time in trials or threats. Instead, she counted afternoons spent watching Zuri paint on the porch, mornings when the sun crept through their kitchen window and warmed the space. That had once felt hollow. The world hadn't changed overnight, but her world had. People still whispered sometimes. Some who had judged her still walked past with tight smiles or eyes that looked down. But she had learned how to see through that now. How to measure herself by truth, not opinion. Her worth had never been in their approval. It had always lived quietly inside her, waiting to be believed in. The community center expanded its outreach program. And Aislinn became more than a volunteer. She became a leader. She started hosting small circles for women who had fallen through the cracks, just like she once had. Women who carried invisible histories. Women who had learned to speak in coded ways just to be heard at all. She never told them what to do. She simply sat with them, listened. Sometimes she'd share a story, a piece of her own, not to teach, but to connect. And when she looked into their eyes and saw that familiar weight, she would say softly, "I know." And those two words often meant more than hours of therapy. One afternoon, a young officer came to the center. Nervous, uncertain, he had heard about her case, but not from the news, from his own father, who had once been quick to judge. The officer said he wanted to do better. He asked if she would speak at the academy. She almost declined, but then she thought about Zuri, about how change never came from silence. So she said yes. When she stood before those cadets in crisp uniforms, she didn't recite dates or legal terms. She simply told them the cost of assumption, the weight of a badge, the power they held not just to arrest, but to protect dignity. She told them what it meant to be misread, mishandled, mistaken, and how one kind decision could rewrite someone's entire life. Some of them nodded, some looked away, but she had planted something. That was enough. Zuri began middle school. That fall, proud and radiant, her classmates knew her mom was brave. Not just because she wore a blazer and helped people, but because she had survived something dark without becoming bitter. Zuri once told her that she was her favorite. Kind of strong, the quiet kind. Aislinn framed her dismissal letter. Not to forget, but to remember how far she'd come. Right beside it, she hung a simple photograph, her and Zuri. Arms linked, smiles soft, bathed in the light of a new beginning. She often walked past it on her way out the door, pausing just long enough to feel the full weight of gratitude. Some days were still hard. Healing wasn't a straight road. But she had found peace, not because everything had been fixed, but because she had chosen to live anyway with grace. Without apology, the people who once condemned her might never say sorry. The system might never make complete sense. She had reclaimed something no court could give back: her voice, her dignity, her right to exist boldly. And in the quiet hours, when the world slowed and the sky dimmed to that soft in-between shade before night, she would sit beside Zuri on the steps and breathe in the evening air. No cameras, no trials, just the soft hum of crickets, the distant bark of a dog, and the gentle rustle of wind through the leaves. She would close her eyes and let it wash over her. Not the pain, not the past, but the present. A life rebuilt not through vengeance or noise, but through the quiet, stubborn miracle of survival. And every time Zori rested her head on her shoulder, Aislinn knew deeply, finally, that she was exactly where she was meant to be.